Hello and welcome to interest.co.nz. I'm Gareth Vaughan and I'm joined by Richard Yetsenga, who is the ANZ Global Chief Economist. Welcome again, Richard.
Thanks,
Good
Gareth.
to see you.
Yeah.
We're going to have a chat about monetary policy today because both the Reserve Bank of Australia and the Reserve Bank of New Zealand you guys are picking they are going to each cut their cash rates by, on another three occasions by next May, all the way down to 0.25%.
Yes.
We're already at 1%.
Yes.
So why do you think they need to go lower?
Is the 1% working? I mean, both central banks are undershooting their inflation targets. Growth has been slowing in both economies. In New Zealand, the business surveys are suggesting that we probably get some further slowdown in growth. In Australia, growth might be basing out. The housing market looks a little bit better, but New Zealand's coming off a 2.5% growth rate. Australia's potentially stabilising at a 1.5% to 2% growth rate. Difficult to see how either central bank's going to achieve their inflation target under that conditions, given interest rates where they are, even though they're so low from a historical perspective.
Okay, so the 1% you don't think is working or you don't think is going to work. Will 0.25% be the silver bullet?
Probably not. No. I mean, it's very difficult for me to argue that you will get inflation in either Australia or New Zealand sustainably at 2 point something, sustainably at 2.5% based on what either central bank does with monetary policy. I mean, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do anything, because I think their mandates are to achieve an inflation target. They need to deliver into those as best that they can. But the reality is we've got a global environment which is not generating much inflation. We've got, in most economies, weak business investment, and we've got low wage growth. And they're the things which ultimately are going to get inflation back to the target if and when they happen to return.
We've been talking about low inflation, low wage growth, these issues you're mentioning, for some years now. Are we at a point where we should be looking at these central banks' mandates and targets and questioning whether these inflation targets are the right ones anymore or relevant? I mean, this does come up every now and again. What are your thoughts on this?
I think we should. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand led the way on inflation targeting. It chose a particular form of inflation target. Most central banks, apart from the friendly group of basket cases like Zimbabwe and Argentina, have a central bank that conducts policy with an inflation mandate. Never in the last 25 years has there ever really been a question about the central bank's ability to achieve its target. The only question was, what level would you choose? Was it hard-edged or soft-edged? Other administrative issues. But there was no question about achieving the target. Now, of course, even with quantitative easing in some economies, interest rates below zero, interest rates in New Zealand at 1%, which even 5 years ago you would have thought would never happen, we still can't achieve the inflation target. Yeah, I think we need to have a look at what the targets are, how they intersect with structural issues in the economy, what their successes and failures have been, and have a long, hard think about whether we've got the right framework.
Do you have an alternative framework in mind?
No. The only thing I can think about at the moment is easing a lot when it's not doing a lot might not seem like the right thing. When you have an economy with a reasonable amount of debt, the last thing you want is inflation expectations to get unanchored to the downside. The last thing you want is to get entrenched kind of deflationary expectations. That would be a much worse situation, I think. So what central banks are doing, to me, is entirely appropriate. But probably I'd prefer maybe a do no harm approach to policy. If growth is okay and there's no further deterioration in inflation, even though you're undershooting, I think why wouldn't you just be patient and be happy with that and see how things transpire? But that's not the way we run policy. We have an active target. We need to do what we can to get it.
Now, there's been quite a lot of talk in New Zealand around whether the government should come in with some major fiscal stimulus infrastructure projects, take advantage of its good credit rating, relatively low crown debt in New Zealand, borrow some money and
low bond yields.
Yeah, and help the Reserve Bank out. What's your view on that, and is that same debate happening in Australia?
Look, there's a famous quote out of the US: if interest rates were at zero, we should bulldoze the Rocky Mountains. So I think it's attractive to think about low bond yields and say, well, the government should borrow and spend some money. Yeah, and particularly when you're growing your economy through, one of the primary means you're generating growth is by importing people, which a lot of small open economies are doing. You need infrastructure for quality of life reasons to move people around, and hospitals and school capacity and all those things. So you need that. Is it going to sustainably drive growth? The answer is no, it's not. I mean, you can ratchet up infrastructure a little bit, but you spend some time in the centre of Auckland, it's pretty disruptive when you need to do large-scale infrastructure. It's environmentally unfriendly, pretty much by definition. It's extremely expensive. And if you want to drive growth in the economy, you need to do more infrastructure on top of the more infrastructure every year. I think talking about stimulus in a way is unhelpful, not that it's not important, because it takes us away from the fact that there are some big secular issues here, and chasing growth for the next year or the next 2 years, sure, we ideally will have a bit of that, but actually it's the structural picture which needs the work.
We've talked before about the impact of technology around the world, and you said it's bigger than the impact of China on the global economy.
Yes.
You've talked about climate change as well being a deflationary force. There seem to be a lot of these deflationary forces around.
Yes.
And that inflation, with that inflation target, these are perhaps the big things that these central banks are really battling. I mean, how does this? What's the circuit breaker here?
Look, that's a great question. We should, at some point, the sort of technology disruption we're going through, which for virtually every occupation, every industry, every company, they're being disintermediated or adjusted in some way because of technology. Ultimately, we should come out of that with higher average living standards, more income growth, better paying jobs. But we're in the disruptive phase. Now, if you look at the Industrial Revolution, there's evidence that the disruptive phase lasted for 50 years. I have no view on how long or short this disruptive phase will be relative to that, but it could go on for quite a period of time. I mean, that's about the only really positive circuit breaker I see at this point, that we do get the productivity wave coming out of technology, and that drags living standards higher the way every other productivity wave has done. Unfortunately, around climate change and its deflationary impacts, I think we're just really starting to see the early effects of that. And
that could play out for some time?
Look, I think it will play out for some time. If you think around energy, for instance, I mean, the way an economist looks at climate change and says you're taking an externality and bringing it into the price of something, it should drive the price up. Governments aren't always doing that, though. If you think about energy, rather than taking fossil fuel prices up by bringing the externality in, they're subsidising alternative energy to drive a substitution from fossil fuel-driven energy to alternative energy. So they're driving prices down, in a sense, right? In the US now, you can install wind-generating electricity capacity more cheaply than you can LNG. That's deflation. If you get higher food prices because of more volatile climatic conditions, sure, technically the price of food has gone up, but people then direct more of their expenditure to food because it's a necessity and they spend less on other things. Ultimately, actually, the broader impact of that is deflationary because you suck expenditure from other parts of the economy. And you're seeing it today with the swine flu issues in China. The price of protein globally has gone up. If you happen to grow protein, lucky for you. If you happen to consume it, it's turning into a pretty difficult household budget issue.
Okay. So if the RBA and the RBNZ get to 0.25% in May, as ANZ is now predicting, what then? Do they reach their targets?
Look, there's a new acronym we're using, ELB, the effective lower bound. I mean, I think the experience of Europe is you can still have some easing impact taking interest rates below zero, but a 25-point cut below zero is much less effective than a 25-point cut when you're in positive territory. And one of the key reasons is because you impair the ability of the banking system to deliver credit. So we're hopeful that central banks in Australia and New Zealand choose other mechanisms at those low, if further easing is needed at those low yields, rather than taking rates into negative territory.
What would you like to see them use if they do get to that point?
Look, I think it will be something in the QE realm, and the objective will be, they may not say it's the objective. One of the byproducts will be to hopefully get the exchange rate down and keep it down. And I think there is a bit of pressure between Australia and New Zealand here around relative exchange rate competitiveness, particularly for New Zealand. I think if the Reserve Bank eased aggressively, it probably just will, through the currency market, put a bit of tension on New Zealand policy settings, given where the Kiwi-Aussie cross rate is.
So look, we live in interesting times.
That's a
don't we?
Chinese curse, unfortunately,
Yeah.
rather than intellectual stimulation, but we do.
Yeah, well, look, thanks a lot for that,
Thank you,
Richard.
Gareth.
That's Richard Yetsenga, the Global Chief Economist from ANZ, and I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz.